Hello watch enthusiasts and welcome to Watch Chronicler Unscripted. In today's episode of this video and podcast, depending upon whether you're listening to this podcast on Spotify, SoundCloud or on iTunes as well, or whether you're watching this video on YouTube, I'm speaking about all things Japanese. Japan is in many ways the second home of watchmaking. Watchmaking in Europe is of course enormously heavily rooted historically and also in terms of the culture within that area. But Japan is very much the second home of watchmaking, and in the last 50 or so years, in fact you could go back about 70 years, they've made some really incredible watches and continue to do so today. But today I'd like to speak about how Japan became this hub of high-end watchmaking which it is today. Of course we all know the affordable watches coming from Japan, but not all of us are aware of the depth which goes into the high quality, really high-end models which they produce, and how they've become world-class watchmakers. So today I'd like to speak about this history. Before I do, remember to like, share and subscribe, and also head over to our Instagram to catch the latest updates, whether it's photography, new articles, videos or podcasts. You'll be the first to see them there. Also go to watchchronicler.com to be able to see full articles which you can't find here on the YouTube channel or elsewhere for Watch Chronicler. Now the story of Japanese watchmaking starts, you could say, in the 16th century when they were first introduced to clockwork and timekeeping of that nature by immigrant forces, whether they were forces or indeed whether they were just traders. These things found their way into Japan. And for several hundred years after that, which is quite an interesting point actually in its own right, whether you're looking at the history, the politics or the art within Japan, they had a few hundred years of isolationist policies where they avoided contact with other nations. Certainly there wasn't much mixing during that period, and until the 19th century this was very much the case. This also meant they had a different calendar and timing system. Until 1872, they had a setup whereby the calendar was a lunar calendar rather than a solar calendar. So that meant that their month lengths were different, their years were different in that way, and they also addressed time differently, which is perhaps even more important for a watch, because their way of telling the time was to break the day into the space between sunrise and sunset, so you had a day and night, and then split the day into 6 equal portions. Of course this varies throughout the year, and means that creating a watch for that would be a real problem. By contrast, after 1872 they adopted a more Western approach, so a solar year with solar months, as well as a setup whereby you had 24 hours in a day. The result was they could actually build on clocks and watches to create something reliable and functional, and this started to develop in the late 19th century. Now of course other countries played with different lengths of days. I know that France experimented with a 10-day week and a decimal hour system, neither of which caught on because they just didn't work. But certainly in Japan this was a much longer lasting fact of life. However, by the late 19th century they started to produce technological advances where mechanical timekeeping was concerned. In 1893, for example, Seiko, not necessarily in the form we know it today, was founded. And they specialised in clocks in their early years. That was very much their bread and butter, but watches came a bit later. Also, some sources suggested that from the mid-1890s, American engineers started to show the use of lever escapements in Japan. Now, if you're using a rudimentary pocket watch, like maybe a 16th century pocket watch from Europe, or a clock where it actually is quite functional, you could have something like a verge escapement. But in a watch this really isn't practical. So the introduction of a lever escapement to the Japanese watchmakers and clockmakers at that point rather than watchmakers was revolutionary. Now, Seiko started to produce watches, and it's the earliest record I've found of watches being produced in Japan, in the late 1890s. Now these, interestingly, didn't actually make a profit. There wasn't even a profit from their production until 1911. So you can see the fact they really were in their infancy in Japan. So during this period, watches were a very minor part of industry in Japan and weren't something which the nation was known for. By 1912, according to Japanese sources, just under 4 million watches were produced a year in Japan, which is a significant increase for a country which 20 years prior hadn't produced any watches, or a very minimal number, if any. So one does see this advance in those early years, and by the 20s and the interwar period, brands were starting to spring up in new ways. 1930 was a particularly important year because this was the year that Citizen was established, or at least the company which would become the Citizen we know today. Now, there were backgrounds to that company in years before 1930, but it was in 1930 when watches became the priority. And in 1931 they launched their first watch, and in the mid-30s they started having reasonably widely produced 8-line calibers. And by the way, as I address lines, linear or lines, it's a quite old system for measuring movement size. An ETA 2824 is 11.5 lines, for example. And it's based, as far as I'm aware, on Charlemagne, the Emperor of Europe's hand and finger measurements, and a breakdown of his body, which I believe is the origin of the foot as well, and the inch, which is a very interesting point too, and something perhaps I'll address in a future video or podcast. But the story really behind the development in the 30s, which I think captures the essence of what was being made, was 1937, when Seiko's Daini factory was produced. Now, Daini, I'm sure my pronunciation is appalling to all the Japanese speakers in the audience, but this, signifying second, was the first dedicated watchmaking factory for Seiko. And it's not surprising this was in 1937 and not any later, because during the war, a period of financial and economic instability for Japan, after all, that was a major contribution to why they entered the war and went in the direction they did. But by the end of the war, they were also in a very bad way indeed. And Japanese watchmaking suffered, bearing in mind the fact that by the late 40s, they'd only been producing watches in a serious way in terms of wristwatches, at least, as opposed to pocket watches, for about 15 years, and some of those years have been taken away by the war. It's not surprising this stalled development quite profoundly. Also, one finds that during this period, and in the later years of the 40s, they had very few facilities still open. Seiko, for example, had all of its facilities destroyed except for their Suwa factory, which I'll come to later because it's a very important factory in terms of their history. But 60% of factories and establishments for producing watches were destroyed, and so it left Japan in a difficult way where watches were concerned. In the 40s, after the war as well, sanctions, post-war sanctions, currency problems in terms of the strength of currency, as well as taxation and tariffs, meant that Japan's development of watches just didn't have enough money. There was some progress towards it, but these were still very small companies without the sort of weight or heft of some of the much larger European counterparts. However, by the 1950s, a very different approach was starting to develop in Japan. In the late 40s, they had to focus on a market which was primarily Eastern, as opposed to competing with the same markets as Swiss or European or even American counterparts, because of the quality of their watches, which I will come to later in the podcast, because this is an important part of their development. But by the early 50s, Citizen in particular was really pioneering achieving the same complications in Japanese watches as in Swiss or European watches. So, for example, in 1952, they launched the first Japanese watch to include a date. And in fact, it was a complete calendar, so it had the day, the date, and the month. And rather imaginatively, it was simply called the calendar watch. But its appearance was very much that of something you might have seen from Movado, for example, in the 40s. It was a design which was not Japanese at all in the sense that we would look at it today. It was something much more rudimentary and much more classical. Then in 1956, another important development was parashock. This has been described in some publications as seismic seismically resistant watches, but to be honest, parashock is a much better way of putting it, and it was what the technology was patented as, which was shock resistance for their watches. And Citizen developed quite a level of showmanship actually during these years, because they, for example, to demonstrate parashock in '56, dropped one of these watches from a helicopter over Kyoto to demonstrate the resistance of these movements to the impact of hitting the ground. They also developed water-resistant watches with O-rings. And bearing in mind, to put this into perspective, of course, Europe had some dive watches at this point, which went far and away beyond what Japan was achieving at this point. The Submariner was released in 1954, the Seamaster 300 in '57, and the Blancpain 50 Fathoms and Zodiac Super Seawolf in '53. But let's face it, Japan wasn't at that stage yet. They were developing functional dress watches. And the example which they produced, which Citizen produced, was put on 130 buoys in the Pacific Ocean and left there for about a year, during which time they were exposed to the sea, to salt, to waves, and when they were recovered a year later, they were working, which is quite remarkable by any standards for something designed to be a dress watch. And finally, in '58, they released Japan's first alarm watch, and this resembled something like a JLC Memovox, with a rotating inner dial, which allowed you to set the alarm with a second crown. So there was very much a following on from Swiss innovation or European innovation, which Citizen showed, and in fact brought Japan forward, I think, during this period. But if Japan was going to compete with Switzerland in particular, it was going to need to make high-quality, accurate watches. And Japan, in a typical way really, in terms of the way they arranged themselves, where industry is concerned, started having competitions in 1948, as early as '48, for their watches. And the results were pretty shocking, frankly. The watches didn't keep time anything like their Swiss counterparts, and so there was a very clear need to modernise and develop. But by the '50s, development was coming. Now, I've spoken about what Citizen did, but Seiko, I think, was important in taking the next logical step, which was forward in terms of absolute quality. And Citizen does reappear later in this, but I think Seiko was the pioneer at this stage. The reason why I say that is because Seiko decided that it needed to create competition within itself to advance. Now in '56, Seiko launched the Marvel. Now the Marvel was the first of the high-end Seikos. It looked very European in design, really not very much to look at, frankly. But it started this, the knowledge that there was potential, and that's an important step for any country to make whilst developing a watch. So Seiko, in its particular way of approaching work, decided to pit the Daini and Suwa factories against each other to produce the best watch. And this type of internal competition led to some of the most exciting Japanese watches ever made, and a really amazing decade in the '60s of new design, new watches, and real cutting-edge innovation. Now, the first sign of this was in 1959. When Grand Seiko was formed. Grand Seiko was, for the most part, and I say this for the most part because in the late '60s there was a slight changeover for some brief occasions, but was generally the Suwa Seiko factory, the name they gave their top-of-the-line watches. And in terms of their origins, Grand Seiko's 1959 release was the 3180. This was a 25-jewel manually wound dress watch, which was chronometer certified, not Swiss chronometer, but Japanese chronometer certified, which was simply conducted in Japan as opposed to Switzerland. It was, of course, shock resistant too, and it set a standard. Again, a very Swiss appearance, more fussy than you see from later Japanese designs, but it was Genesis for Seiko. It was the proof that they could produce something really impressive. Now, loosely, it was based on the Seiko Marvel, in terms of its development approach, in terms of the way it was built and conceived. The Daini factory took a different approach, and not an entirely successful one, it has to be said. Because their first watch came out a few years later, there's some argument and debate as to when that actually was. The earliest I've heard mentioned, this was in a Seiko brochure from a few decades ago, said that its first watch was in 1961. However, usually, I've never seen proof of one being released onto the market before 1963, and in fact some believe that it was actually 64 when these were actually on sale. But I think 63 is the most common date take, and this was the King Seiko. Now, King Seikos don't sell for anything like the amount of money which Grand Seikos sell for. I think largely because King Seiko doesn't exist anymore, but Grand Seiko does. Again, that's not actually quite true, but certainly in name that's true. And so they released a watch which wasn't chronometer grade, but it was a new design, it was a new approach, it was a new technology. And this sparked some development in the mid-60s. But it couldn't compete, certainly in terms of quality, with Grand Seiko. Now, this podcast isn't intended to be entirely about Seiko, so I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of every model produced during this period, though it would be fascinating to do so. And if you do have an interest in that, then please tell me in the comments section if you're watching this on YouTube, because I'd be very interested to produce a podcast or video if that would be something appreciated, because there are some amazing watches from the period. But an important figure at this point was Toro Tanaka. Now, I'm sure my pronunciation is dismal, so I apologise, but he was employed by the Seiko Corporation in 1959. And he pretty much single-handedly, with a few principles, in a similar vein to some architects who put forward principles, like Le Corbusier, for example, principles for watch design. And his watch design was very simple. Now, I'll actually put up on the screen, if you're watching this on YouTube, the exact principles he put out. But the general aesthetics he took were to have a watch with a simple bezel, facets and angles, and exquisite quality throughout in terms of sharp, flat areas of polish. And this is very much the origin of what we now see in these Zaratsu polished Grand Seikos, which are truly stunning nowadays. And in fact, top-of-the-line Citizens are just as beautiful as a result of this philosophy. And the first watch which really was shaped by this was the 57GS, a Grand Seiko as well, of the 60s. This watch did away with the narrow spindly lugs and the very classic style, and instead had wide, bold shoulders instead of lugs, which were beautifully faceted and cut, exquisite hands, a simple bezel, a simple dial, and a comparably small crown, actually, which created a proportional setup, which I think is stunning. I think it's one of the most beautiful Seikos ever produced. Could even be one of the most beautiful watches ever produced. And I encourage you to have a look at full photos of it all around, because it's worth it. And this sparked the beginning of what we now see as Japanese design, where watches are concerned. And the watch which immortalised this design was the 44GS from 1967. This incorporated those lugs into the general shape of the case and created a really stunning demonstration of what could be done. This was also a time when a black line was introduced to the centre of Grand Seiko and King Seiko hands to really create a look which was clean, sharp, and in line with a rapidly modernising country. This is, after all, a country known for things like the bullet train, and these really did speak of that style of nation looking forward. So those were enormously important. But during this period, incidentally a period in the late 60s when the last entirely handmade Japanese Seiko movements were produced, movements were becoming more and more advanced. High beat movements were starting to appear in the late 60s, but actually much earlier Seiko had entered both Suwa and Daini factories into chronometer competitions in Neuchâtel in Switzerland. Now, previously chronometer testing had been conducted in Japan, but this was an opportunity for the Japanese watches to show themselves in a public way. And it didn't go that well. Suwa came 144th in these tests, and Daini 152nd, I believe. 153rd, actually. And the general principle here was that these watches had to resist temperature changes, and a lot of the watches competing were able to keep to ranges within 0.75 seconds a day, in terms of variation, which is pretty amazing for a 45-day test for these watches. And Seiko didn't throw in the towel at this point. They came back in 1967 and did a pretty amazing job. Their results were for Sewer 12th, but Dainey did particularly well, and maybe this explains why some late 60s Grand Seikos were produced by the Dainey factory rather than the Sewer factory, because they ended up coming 4th, 5th, 7th and 8th in this competition. And this was a period also when some quartz chronometers were starting to compete, so it shows actually just what quality Seiko was showing. And after this frankly incredible display, they were actually not able to compete in 1968 because the competition was, to the best of my knowledge, cancelled. But it then became known that the watches actually still had been tested, and for accuracy, the Seiko watches came 4th to 10th, well, from 4th place to 10th place in the scores, only being beaten by quartz watches, which is astounding, frankly. It really is astounding considering the calibre of watches these pieces were going up against during this period. Now, of course, this does show a certain Swiss bias, the fact that the competition was cancelled, though I don't have proof that it was cancelled for this reason. I think it's fairly telling. And I think this demonstrates the level, the calibre, in fact, which they reached. But it was clear in this period that this wasn't their intention, and whilst this formed the foundation for modern Grand Seiko, because in the 70s, the Sewer and Dainey Grand Seiko concept crumbled because during this period they merged into a more modern Grand Seiko, instead of having King and Grand Seiko competing against each other. But that didn't matter because from the 70s onwards, mechanical Grand Seikos stopped being produced because Seiko was really set on producing quartz watches because of the potential there. And that's something you see throughout Japanese history. They don't rest on their laurels. You really don't see that many top-end movements being repeated for years and years. You do see regular development, which is both a blessing and a curse if you're trying to buy used watches because parts are scarce as a result of this policy, but it did make genuine improvements in leaps and bounds. It is worth noting that this work wasn't confined to just Seiko, because Citizen released the Chrono Master in the middle of the 60s, which played off a similar design. It had the same sharp lines as Tanaka's Seikos, and demonstrated the fact that they were going to follow through with this new Japanese aesthetic as well. And these watches were generally not regarded as at the level of Grand Seiko, but they're impressive pieces nonetheless. Now, Citizen also worked with some electric watches during this period, but it was really Seiko which started off this idea in 1959, when they started development on a quartz chronometer. And this was showcased in the 1964 Japanese Olympics, when this very sizable unit was used to time sporting events. And we all know that whilst Switzerland was developing quartz movements, they didn't really end up with something particularly successful in time to outdo Japan, because on Christmas Day in 1969, the Swiss industry received really not the present they would have expected or wanted, which, also bearing in mind the fact that the Japanese had released the earliest automatic chronograph that year, beating the Zenith El Primero, ironically. Seiko then released the Quartz Astron, the 35SQ. And the 35SQ was accurate to 3 seconds a month. It cost as much as a car, 450,000 yen, and in gold with a unique look. It was the future. And frankly, Seiko didn't look back, and in the late 80s they started producing their quartz movements again at a higher level then, and then, under the Grand Seiko branding, and then in the late 90s they launched mechanical again. But from then on, the most accurate watches in the world were Japanese. And so I think this forms the story of how they reached that level and became this force of nature in the watch world. Now, this concludes the story, but at the moment, as a side note, I'm looking to add a top-of-the-line, probably vintage, but it could be a modern, potentially, something like a Seiko Landmaster, potentially, to my collection. So I'd love to hear your votes for what you fancy, what you think I really should buy from 50s or 60s, maybe 70s Seiko or Citizen as something really groundbreaking, and tell me why you think I should pick that particular model. Admittedly being reasonable with price, because frankly buying a Platinum Credor, wonderful though the idea would be, is beyond my means. But tell me what you thought of this podcast in the comment section down below, and do follow us or subscribe on whatever platform you're listening or watching this podcast on. But thank you very much for listening and watching, and I hope you enjoyed the podcast. So this is Armand from watchchronicler.com, out.